The United States took a hardline approach by firing on and seizing an Iranian cargo ship just as the ceasefire was ending, increasing tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. Today, we'll examine this situation more closely. Let's begin. On April 19th, the US military opened fire and seized an Iranian cargo ship near the Strait of Hormuz. According to the US Central Command, an Iranian-flagged container ship named Tuskow, which was traveling from China to Bandar Abbas in Iran, was seized. The Tuskow were reportedly warned multiple times for breaking the maritime blockade. Despite the US Navy's repeated warnings over 6 hours to stop, the Tuskow kept trying to break through the maritime blockade, so the US Navy deployed a destroyer, ordered the crew to come out of the engine room, and then fired several rounds from a 5-inch Mk-45 naval gun to disable the ship. After that, they sent the Marines to seize the ship. This is the first time the US has actually used force to stop an Iranian vessel since imposing the maritime blockade on Iran. There have been previous cases where Iranian vessels were turned back after warning broadcasts. But this is the first time force has been used. President Trump also said on Truth Social that the Iranian cargo ship Tuskow tried to break through our maritime blockade. He said it was a massive ship, 900 feet long, as big as an aircraft carrier, but things didn't go well for them. He also revealed that our Navy stopped the ship in its tracks by making a hole in the engine room. Afterward, the Iranian military claimed responsibility for a drone attack on a US warship in response. Iran's Central Military Command, Hatam al-Anbiya Central Command, announced through state media that they struck a US warship in response to the US seizing their vessel, and warned that if America's acts of piracy and attacks continue, military responses will also continue. There has not yet been any confirmation of US military casualties. It also has not been confirmed whether Iran actually carried out a drone attack on the US Navy. President Trump then issued an ultimatum-style warning to Iran. President Trump said that we made a very fair and reasonable offer and hope they accept it. Otherwise, the United States will destroy all of Iran's power plants and bridges. He said they would collapse easily in an instant. The problem is that the ceasefire negotiations themselves are currently facing difficulties. The US negotiation team has now arrived in Pakistan. Iran isn't sending its negotiation team, citing the US ceasefire violation as the reason. According to reports from Iran's state news agency IRNA, there are even reports that Iran has refused to participate in the second round of negotiations. Of course, depending on the sources inside Iran, the story varies a bit. Some say negotiations are ongoing. Some say negotiations are ongoing, while others report they've been refused, so we should watch this more closely. Iran insists they won't negotiate unless the United States lifts the maritime blockade. On the other hand, the United States claims that Iran firing on ships in the Strait of Hormuz is a violation of the ceasefire agreement, so both sides are continuing a tense standoff. Hopes for peace faded when, despite Lebanon and Israel agreeing to a ceasefire and Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz, expectations for an agreement were dashed. Now the question is what happens next? The possibility that the negotiation table itself might collapse is growing. If the second round of negotiations in Islamabad, Pakistan fails or is just a formality, the situation will enter a new phase. President Donald Trump has already mentioned possible further military action after the 22nd. If the United States takes more military action and conflict resumes, the situation will intensify and could lead to another large-scale war. Especially, Iran is unlikely to let itself be the only one taking the hit again. There is a high possibility that it will target the oil facilities of oil-producing countries in the Gulf region, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This region is a vital oil hub with many refineries and export terminals. If even one facility here is hit, oil prices will immediately surge and even global financial markets will be shaken. Additionally, Iran keeps raising the threat of blocking the Red Sea. Even if Iran doesn't take direct action, there's a high possibility that it could carry out this plan indirectly through the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are pro-Iranian forces. They control a key point at the Red Sea entrance, and blocking it would make the situation much worse. If the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is blocked, Europe-Asia maritime logistics will be paralyzed. Ships to the Suez Canal must detour, greatly increasing time and costs. Because of this, ceasefire talks need to happen somehow. Currently, Europe has just 6 weeks of aviation fuel, and rising fuel costs from Southeast Asia's energy crisis are cutting public transportation operations. If this continues, the aftermath will likely worsen. The main issue is there's no guarantee the negotiations will succeed. President Trump has already unilaterally been pushing ceasefire talks with Iran. There are also suspicions being raised that they might resume surprise attacks again. Iran currently suspects that the United States' negotiation moves are actually an attempt to build justification for resuming attacks. According to Axios in the United States, several Iranian officials believe that President Trump's true intention might be to resume the war. If the differences between the US and Iran are so great, some are even suggesting that it would be better to extend the ceasefire and continue talks. We'll have to see how the agreement develops. Meanwhile, Iran appears to be pushing things further. BBC reports that Ebrahim Azizi, chairman of Iran's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, has taken a very hardline stance. He firmly stated that Iran's right to passage through the Hormuz Strait is non-negotiable and added that Iran alone will decide if ships can pass through the strait. The important point here is that they are not just aiming for military control, but also trying to establish complete legal control. Chairman Azizi said he would enshrine this authority in law and noted the bill has already been submitted to Parliament. This bill, grounded in environmental protection, maritime safety, and national security, is being pursued under Article 110 of the Iranian Constitution. If passed, the military will enforce it. This means that military organizations, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, will become the de facto administrators of the Strait of Hormuz. The significance of this statement is considerable. Iran has previously pressured the strait with military threats or blockades. This time, they plan to control the international strait using their own national laws, going further than before. In other words, this is an attempt to turn the Strait of Hormuz from an international waterway into a controlled zone that can only be passed with Iran's permission. This approach shakes the very foundation of the international maritime order. Gulf countries are quickly opposing these actions. For instance, the UAE calls Iran's blockade attempt a hostile act of piracy. This is not just a simple diplomatic criticism, but rather a strong statement that borders on accusing Iran of violating international law. The UAE warned that if this measure is implemented, it could impact the Strait of Hormuz and set a dangerous precedent for global maritime routes. There is concern that if one country starts legally controlling a strategic choke point, others may attempt the same elsewhere. What matters here is that the conflict doesn't just remain a standoff between the US and Iran. Since Gulf countries' interests are directly involved, the conflict could expand significantly. Especially oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE export their oil through the Strait of Hormuz, so the moment Iran restricts passage, they will be directly hit economically. In this case, we cannot rule out the possibility that these countries might take military action. This situation might sound like someone else's problem right now, but that's not the case at all. Korea relies on the Middle East for most of its oil imports, and the key route for that is the Strait of Hormuz. The moment this route is blocked, the oil coming into Korea will decrease or be delayed. Then, the first to react will be the oil refineries. If oil supply is unstable, refineries adjust to protect inventory, causing fuel prices to rise quickly. And that's not all. Rising fuel prices quickly increase logistics costs, which then raise the prices of all goods, including food, daily necessities, and industrial products. But the problem is, even if Iran starts charging a transit fee for the Strait of Hormuz, that's another issue in itself. Originally, passage through the Strait of Hormuz was free. But if Iran starts charging a transit fee, that cost will be a burden for refineries. This will directly lead to higher prices in Korea. If Iran begins charging a transit fee in the Strait of Hormuz, other key strategic straits will likely follow suit. It's unlikely, but if transit fees are imposed in the Strait of Malacca, it would create major problems for export-dependent Korea. Japan would face a similar situation. Japan relies heavily on the Middle East due to its low energy self-sufficiency. If the strait is blocked, Korea and Japan will be affected simultaneously, shaking the entire Asian energy market. In this case, it could go beyond simple price increases and even lead to fuel shortages in some countries. Already, such problems are becoming visible in the Southeast Asian region. However, it seems that this negotiation is not something that will be resolved overnight.